Hey everyone, it's John Heath here again for Milton Rose Learning with another Let's Learn lesson on the turning points of World War II, 1942 to 1943. So this is obviously from our World War II series, and this is where it starts to go pretty bad for the Axis and the Allies turn the tide in the conflict. Okay, so so we're going to look at the context and the causes, what was driving World War II to actually turn in the Allies' favour. Then we'll give you a really good chronology for your history notes that you can use to beef up your notes in your books. We'll look at a little turning point, and then we will also look at the tertiary, secondary and primary significant events from these turning points in World War II. So without further ado, let's dive in. So let's look at what was happening broadly before World War II kind of turned and what was making it turn in the first place. So first off then, we have Axis strategic overextension. So they were basically trying to do too much with too little, if I'm simplifying it. So by 1942, Axis forces were now stretched very thin across thousands of miles from the Atlantic and North Africa to the Volga and the Pacific. They are pretty much everywhere, but they're spread very, very thin. Okay, and that's what we call overextension. This kind of created as well, with this overextension, the battle for resources. So Germany and Japan faced acute fuel and material shortages, which then necessitated over-aggressive drives towards the Caucasus oil and the Middle Eastern trade routes. And you can see the Caucasus oil here for visual aids. The Germans needed that oil or their panzers were going to run out of fuel. It was as simple as that. So that was driving the Germans especially to kind of overextend and to kind of almost leap forward to try and grab the Caucasus oil. So that's one thing that's kind of playing into the events here. The second thing is Allied strategic realignment. So the Germany First doctrine, which was championed especially by Roosevelt in America, within the Grand Alliance, agreed then to prioritise defeating Nazi Germany, because Hitler was seen as the primary kind of threat or security issue that they needed to focus on first, and then focus full strength on Japan, because they were seen as very much a secondary threat, not quite as strong as Nazi Germany. Also the Lend-Lease and mass production. So the US became what we call the arsenal of democracy, a lovely phrase, basically making all the weapons that we would need to defeat fascism. And relocated Soviet factories as well, began outproducing Axis industry in tanks, aircraft and merchant shipping. So basically this is a switch to total war, and we started to outproduce the Axis powers, which over time will start to tell on the battlefield and eventually push them back. Then we have total war mobilization. So the home front pivot as well. So Britain and the USSR achieved total civilian mobilization, directing nearly all of their industrial output and female labor as well, crucially, into war production. As you can see in the kind of image, they were kind of very, very much females were the backbone really of their kind of munitions production. Also, there was a switch politically, or not a switch, but a kind of an absolute kind of iron law now that was put into diplomacy, no negotiated peace. So the Allied leaders at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943 demanded the unconditional surrender of all Axis powers. This was going to be a fight to the finish, okay? And again, that encouraged the Axis powers to go for broke, because there's no point doing anything else, because the Allied leaders are just going to grind you down to an unconditional surrender anyway. Okay, so I would say those are the key contextual points to understand going into 1942 and 43, the turning points of World War II. So let's give you a really good chronology now. So first off, we have a wonderful picture there of Bernard Montgomery, General Montgomery at the time, in his command tank during the Second Battle of El Alamein. So let's go into that first. So October to November 1942, the Second Battle of El Alamein in North Africa. So Operation Lightfoot. General Montgomery's 8th Army launched a massive artillery barrage against Rommel's Panzer Army Africa, or Panzer Corps, Africa Corps, sorry, in Egypt. Okay, and that was a really big turning point because we'd taken a beating from Rommel, and Rommel was a brilliant general, but this was a time where we started to turn the tide in North Africa. The Suez Canal then was secure, so Allied victory drove Axis forces out of Egypt finally, and permanently protected the Middle Eastern oil and the vital Mediterranean trade routes, okay, which were kind of coming through the Suez Canal. Operation Torch as well in November 1942, Anglo-American amphibious landings in Vichy, Morocco and Algeria trapped Axis armies in a two-front vice across North Africa. So Montgomery coming from one side and then the Americans coming from the other side, and we squeezed Rommel out basically of North Africa. So that was the start of the beginning of the end, you could say. Meanwhile, the Russians are doing their bit and then some. So August 1942 to February 1943, we have one of the most famous battles of all time, the Battle of Stalingrad. And the Germans called it the Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats, because this was brutal, close quarters urban combat, as you can see in the image there, reduced Stalingrad to rubble as General Vasily Chuikov's 62nd Army held the Volga riverbanks. Then the Russians, being they're starting to get much more operationally minded now on the battlefield. So they launched Operation Uranus on the 19th of November. So Red Army armoured pincers broke through the weak Romanian flanks and encircled General Paulus's German 6th Army, which was one of the strongest formations in the German army. So they're surrounded now. And they basically squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. And there's the surrender at Stalingrad on the 2nd of Feb 1943. That captured over 91,000 surviving German troops who surrendered, and it resulted in over 800,000 total Axis casualties. So the Russians really smashed the Germans there. It was a massive part of this turning point. Then the turning point in the Atlantic comes in May 1943. So you can see we're really starting to get into our stride now. So there was a technological leap. So Allied long-range B-24s, Liberators, Hedgehog depth charges, which we dropped into the ocean to blow up U-boats, and Centimetric Radar eliminated what was called the Mid-Atlantic air gap. The Germans were obviously very smart, and they knew that air cover could only go so far over the Atlantic, so they used to wait in the middle, called the Atlantic Gap, and that's where they would do a lot of their sinkings because there was no air cover. However, as we know, Allied aircraft started to kind of close that gap through technological advancements. So they started to eliminate that mid-range Atlantic gap. Also, brilliant work done by Alan Turing and English cryptographers at Bletchley Park. Basically cracked the four-rotor German naval Enigma, which you can see a working copy of the Enigma in that image. That was what Germans used to send their codes. We cracked the codes, so that allowed Allied convoys to steer around U-boat wolf packs because we knew where they were. Okay, so that was a massive, massive breakthrough. And Black May, the Kriegsmarine lost 43 U-boats in a single month, which was massive, forcing Admiral Nimitz to withdraw submarines from the North Atlantic. Okay, and the battle for the Atlantic starts to recede after that. Okay, so there's a lot going on, isn't there? And then at the end of the chronology here, July to August 1943, the Battle of Kursk, the biggest tank battle in history, and the invasion of Sicily, southern part of Italy. So Operation Citadel, which was the Battle of Kursk, July 1943. So as I said, the largest tank battle in history, and it saw heavily fortified Soviet defence lines finally break the German strategic offensive in the east. You can see in that quite famous image there, that's a German anti-tank gunner whose tank crew has been killed, and he's kind of he's in despair there at the Battle of Kursk. Then in the west, Operation Husky, in July 1943. That was the Allied invasion of Sicily, and it triggered the political overthrow and arrest of the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. So Hitler loses his best friend, basically, at least for a while, until he sends commandos to rescue him. But nevertheless, the Allies are on the march in Italy now. Permanent Axis retreat as well. So from August 1943, Nazi Germany permanently lost the strategic initiative on all fronts, and they are fighting now a defensive war all the way back to Berlin. Okay, so that is some of the key turning points, but what's the turning point of the turning points? There's a couple I think are the most important. So for me, I think Stalingrad and Black May, so winter 1942 to spring 1943. So first off, I think there's a catastrophic strategic loss. The annihilation of the 6th Army at Stalingrad broke the backbone of the Wehrmacht's offensive power forever. The German army was not the same after Stalingrad. It was permanently fighting fires. It was still capable of tactical counteroffensives. Some of them were tactically brilliant. But strategically, they've lost the initiative now, and you're just responding to Russia's punches on the Eastern Front. Also, the Atlantic lifeline was secured, so winning the Battle of the Atlantic guaranteed the safe passage of millions of American troops and supplies for the liberation of Europe, as shown in official words there. We can get supplies across now constantly without much risk, and so D-Day is very much going to be in the offing, isn't it? Okay, so that is the main historical turning points of World War II. But what was the significance of them, of these turning points? Well, let's have a look. So in terms of tertiary significance, the ones that might not have been that important but are still noteworthy, opening the Western Sea and air dominance. So supply lanes were starting to be unlocked now, so we secured the Atlantic sea routes, and that allowed the massive buildup of US forces and armour in Britain ready for D-Day in 1944. We wouldn't have been able to do that if he was zigzagging across and trying to get through the wolf packs. So I think that was important. You can see the image there of a naval convoy in the Atlantic as well. One of the worst jobs of World War II, absolutely freezing and quite deadly as well. And the combined bomber offensive as well. Round-the-clock bombing started by the RAF at night and the United States Air Force by day, and that began systematically destroying German industrial infrastructure. We were bombing them to bits, basically. So I think those were some of the tertiary significant events. Secondary significance, well, I think in our analysis, I think we have the collapse of the Axis alliance, so the fall of fascist Italy, and you can see Dino Grandi there. He was a fascist politician, and at the fascist Grand Council, he basically brought down Mussolini. Quite brave, actually. So Mussolini's ouster and Italy's surrender in September 1943 forced Germany to divert vital divisions, including some of their crack SS formations, to occupy northern Italy and the Balkans. And those were troops that were badly needed on the Eastern Front. Also, the Grand Alliance cohesion. The Tehran Conference saw Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin coordinate final plans for a cross-channel invasion. Okay, so they started to kind of like conceive now of D-Day and the Western Front and how we would push Nazi Germany back in the West. But what was the primary significance of these turning points? Well, again, you can kind of debate it, can't you? That's one of the beauties of history. But I think the permanent loss of Axis strategic initiative, they never really had the force now to lead the war anymore. They were permanently on the defensive. So defeats at Stalingrad, Kursk and El Alamein forced Germany and Italy into a permanent multi-front retreat. They were just on the defensive now, and they were brilliant on the defensive. But nevertheless, you don't, as I think Napoleon said, you never win a war on the defensive. You can only win a war offensively, pretty much. So the Germans were struggling from here on in. And irreplaceable attrition. The Axis lost millions of veteran soldiers, tanks and pilots that their resource-starved industries could never replace. And we can kind of see these soldiers trudging into captivity after the Battle of Stalingrad, and they're taken off the battlefield and they can't fight for Nazi Germany anymore. They're in Russian prison camps. So this was very much the beginning of the end for the Axis powers. So what you can see there is quite breathlessly, but there's a lot going on there, and there were big turning points. 1942 to 43 was the real hinge points of World War II for me, and the Germans and the Axis broadly were staring down the barrel of a gun here. They were going to lose. It was just a case of when, and they were permanently on the defensive after this. So hopefully you've enjoyed that lesson. Don't forget to hit the like, subscribe and tap the bell icon to never miss another Let's Learn video again. Keep your eyes peeled for the remainder of our World War II series, because we'll be uploading very, very soon. And it just remains to say, hopefully you've enjoyed that. It's a real kind of interesting part of the war as well. And like I say, yeah, enjoy studying the rest of it. So we will see you soon, and take care.